Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for another installment of the Westry Horne Cultural Heritage Lecture Series presented by the Frontiers International Plainfield Area Club. I am Jean-Pierre Jenkins, president of the club, and today we address a topic that is often treated as a peripheral debate, but is in fact the central accounting of the American experiment: reparations. Our subtopic thereof is a status report. You see, we are not here merely to debate the morality of this concept. Rather, we are here to analyze the technical, legal, and sociological progress of the movement surrounding it, specifically here in New Jersey. New Jersey's history is unique, often called the slave state of the North. It was, in fact, the last northern state to abolish slavery. Today, we examine how that legacy translates into the modern wealth gap and what is being done to repair that breach. To do this with precision it deserves, we have assembled a panel of the foremost experts in the field. Joining our panel today is Mr. Larry Hamm, a veteran of the front line as the co-founder of the People's Organization for Progress. Mr. Hamm has spent over 5 decades as a relentless advocate for social justice, police reform, and economic repair in Newark and throughout the entirety of the state of New Jersey. Welcome to the panel, Brother Larry.
Thank you. Thank you, Brother Safir. It's good to be here with you and with our other panelists.
Wonderful. The next panelist that we have up today is Jean-Pierre Brutus, Esquire, PhD, Senior Counsel at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. Brutus is a lead voice on the New Jersey Reparations Council and a scholar whose historical research and legislative policy works to bridge the gap that we continue to see and experience today. Welcome to the broadcast, Jean-Pierre.
Thank you so much, President Jenkins, for having me this afternoon. I really appreciate it, and I'm honored to be on this panel with my fellow panelists as well.
Thank you. Joining us up next is Jolyon G. Pruszinski, a research historian and author of Anglican Slavery in New Jersey, an initial accounting. He serves as the historian for the Episcopal Diocese of New Jersey Reparations Commission, and he lectures at the prestigious Princeton University on the institutional roots of inequity. Also an alumnus of Princeton University is Brother Larry Hamm. So we have some like-mindedness here as well. But thank you so much for joining us today, Jolyon.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much, President Jenkins. It's an absolute honor to be here with all of you. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Indeed, the privilege is ours as well. Last up on the panel is Dr. Akil Khalfani, Director of the Africana Institute and Associate Professor of Sociology at Essex County College. Dr. Khalfani is a leading sociologist focused on the Pan-African experience and the structural solutions required to achieve true equity. Welcome to the panel, Dr. Khalfani.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
All right, so Mr. Pruszinski, your research into Anglican slavery highlights that this wasn't just individual ownership, as often reported throughout the media, but it was instead a coordinated institutional economic engine that drove slavery throughout the country and the state of New Jersey. So for our audience in Plainfield and in Newark, as well as other areas in the area, how did these specific 18th century religious and economic structures in New Jersey create this durable inequality that we still see in 2026?
That's a great question. Thank you so much, President Jenkins. Essentially, it all starts with the Anglican Church as an arm of the state. It was never established in the colony of New Jersey, but obviously it was working hand in glove with the crown. And so essentially, the church viewed things that worked well for the crown and worked well for loyalty to the crown and the economic success of the crown as also things that would be good for the policy of the church. And so essentially, the church was almost without exception entirely supportive of slavery. The priests who came to New Jersey basically sought to benefit from the plantation economy that was being set up by especially some elite lay Anglicans who were among the most prolific enslavers. And so this group of early wealthy Anglican colonists and priests all sort of collaborated to establish really draconian slave codes that were based on Caribbean models that racialized slavery and associated Black with enslaved and pagan, and white with free and Christian. And essentially, from the earliest period in the 18th century, this was the law. This became the law of the land. Enslaved people were brought. It was incentivized for landowners to bring enslaved people. You would sort of get more initial land grants if you brought more enslaved people. So it was sort of incentivized. And then essentially all of the kind of like key institutions, the sort of at least among the Anglican Church, the churches that got best established were the ones that were most financially successful. So it was the ones that were most invested in the plantation economy and were benefiting the most from it. And so some of the earliest important political figures were part of this. Governor Lewis Morris was an Anglican. Governor William Franklin was an Anglican. And so, you know, they basically viewed there as this kind of salutary relationship between what benefited the crown, what benefited elite Anglicans, and Black people were the people who they decided were safe to oppress. So really from the earliest period, these people were really kind of key movers in establishing the legal structures that were harming Black people on a generational level and establishing a long-term chattel slavery economy in New Jersey.
I would imagine that many of our audience members are quite surprised by many of the facts that you've laid out, which really establish the foundation for the balance of today's discussion. You know, the fact that enslavers were incentivized to not only continue the enslavement, the chattel enslavement of humans originating from Africa here in the United States, but that gap that was created as a result, the disparity that was created as a result, the oppression continued throughout generations. And of course, that gap is still visibly seen today. But I want to turn for a moment, Dr. Pruszinski, to this next question where critics often say, oh, that was a long time ago, and we should get over it. But I'd love it if you'd be able to draw a direct line between the specific land grants and the manor systems of colonial New Jersey and the modern property tax hurdles that Black families continue to face in the state today.
Absolutely. And I just want to be clear, I'm sure some of my fellow panelists have just as much to say about this as I do. So I also look forward to hearing from them about this as well. But essentially, you know, New Jersey has this long history of unequal treatment. unequal treatment of white people versus black people. And the relationships go back all the way to the colonial era. But essentially, as you say, there is a trajectory and there's continuity, right? Part of this sort of unequal treatment was a lot of the laws that were established in the 18th century to remove voting rights from free black people, to remove a lot of the protections, the property protections, okay? And so, even as you sort of have, in some sense, in the 19th century, a little bit of a weakening of some aspects of these relationships under gradual abolition, there's still a lot of patterns that were sort of deeply entrenched. And we see that especially in what develops in terms of Jim Crow type of legislation, segregation, practical exclusion from property ownership that develops after the Civil War. As many of you know, there was basically a long-standing series of patterns of development and that excluded black people from ownership formally in deeds at a local level. Like the way that the laws work in New Jersey, we essentially have the sort of local version at a township level of states' rights, where there's a lot of sort of freedom that municipalities have and did have for a very long time to restrict ownership in various ways. Obviously, the New Jersey Supreme Court overruled some of that in the 20th century. But a lot of these patterns that began back in the colonial era, where there was very limited property ownership opportunities for black residents, and in general, they were sort of relegated to extremely contingent status. A lot of those were perpetuated through ongoing, in some ways, formal establishment, sometimes informal establishment of the legal structures that related to property ownership.
Thank you so much for that. I want to turn for a moment to you, Dr. Brutus. As a member of the New Jersey Reparations Council, you are tasked with moving from theory to law. We often hear the critique that reparations are logistically impossible at a state level. Would you, if you can, walk us through the specific legislative mechanisms currently being proposed to address the more than $300,000 racial wealth gap here in New Jersey?
Sure. So first, one of the things I want to point out to your audience is thinking about reparations not as a single policy or a set of policies, but as a process, right? And a process of repair. And so first, if you think about the harms, not just of slavery, but the harms of Jim Crow and segregation in New Jersey, and the harms after Jim Crow and formal segregation in New Jersey that continue to this day, right? Reparations are a demand for a process of repair for the harms that are occurring throughout the period, repair that takes multiple forms, right? We take our cues in the New Jersey Reparations Council report and the work being done, in which Larry Hamm was part of that. And the demand for repair is vast. The repair is for a new kind of New Jersey, one where black people can flourish, black people can be free, black people can thrive, right? We are living in a world made by reparations, and we want to live in a world made by repair. And so when folks are thinking about sort of the legal aspects or dimensions for repair, there are many kinds of ways in which repair will be done, right? Through many kinds of mechanisms. One of the things that people get caught up in is this idea that you cannot do what is called race-conscious policymaking, right? This fear that once you engage in anything that involves race, the Supreme Court will strike it down, that this is unconstitutional. I want to point out two things. One, the 13th, the 14th, and 15th Amendment are the Reconstruction Amendments. Those amendments fundamentally alter the U.S. Constitution to create what the historian Eric Foner calls a second founding. And those amendments radically shifted our democracy to expand it in a way that previously was not possible before. So when folks say equal protection under the law, that was a phrase that came from abolitionists. Okay? The 14th Amendment was designed to give the legislature, the US Congress, the power to come up with race-conscious remedies to address racial inequalities. It's the Supreme Court afterwards, in the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century, that took steps to limit the power of the 14th Amendment, right? And focus much of its focus on giving the powers of the 14th Amendment to corporations and not to individuals and not to Black people and not to addressing racial injustice. Second, when folks think about repair and reparations, it's long-standing within the law in the US and common law, predating the US, that when the government is involved in harming its citizens and its subjects, individuals and citizens can go to the government for redress for those harms. The Supreme Court upheld this even for racial harms in a case called Crossan in 1989. And so when we're talking about harms, for specific harms, right, that is still to this day constitutional and still something that is enshrined in the law, that when you're talking about specific kinds of harms, and so this is why when you see in places like Evanston, Illinois, and Detroit, and Chicago, and California, and Atlanta, and Boston, where you have all these task forces on reparations in New York and Maryland, people focus on what's called the harm report, right? Detailing the harms within a particular area. Here in New Jersey, right? My fellow panelists talked about redlining, exclusionary zoning, and racial covenants here in New Jersey, right? Those are specific harms when you can detail how the state of New Jersey was deeply involved in administering, overseeing, and reproducing those harms. And so when we're saying that we're calling for repair, we're calling for repair, for example, the racist administration of the GI Bill here in New Jersey, right? We're calling for exclusion of Black people from participating in home ownership through the different mechanisms I just outlined, and the racial home ownership gap, in which white households in New Jersey, about 78% of white households own their home compared to just 38% in New Jersey, which drives the racial wealth gap, which is actually over $600,000 at this moment, right? It only grew post-COVID. And so when we're talking about sort of the legal mechanism, the policy mechanism, it is still the legal and policy foundation that the government has an obligation to repair the harms that it was deeply involved in reproducing and creating. And so that is what shapes our demand. And also, we look to international standards of repair and reparations, in which repair comes in multiple forms, not just the demand for cash payments, which is compensation, but also for one I want to focus on, which is the cessation of and guarantees of non-repetition. The idea and the practice that the policies and the practice that are reproducing the harms need to cease at this moment, and the government and the state needs to commit itself to creating new policies and new practices that will prevent those harms from reoccurring again.
I think it's worth noting that you've highlighted something that is quite critical at this moment. The harms for many years were considered historical in nature. They were considered to be things that were behind us. But as you've indicated, the racial wealth gap, which was sitting at a staggering $300,000 pre-COVID, has now doubled to $600,000 in New Jersey. So it is clear that policies that were once abolished and no longer existed have now been replaced by new policies that continue to widen the gap, continue to perpetuate the harms against Black people. And as we all know, the unemployment rate for Black women, since recent policies and practices have gone into place, is staggeringly higher in an inequitable fashion when compared to the rest of the race sectors across our society. So we have to be certain that we recall how we got here and the fact that the means that were used to bring us here are continuing to be leveraged to really create those disparities. But I want to turn to this second question for you, Dr. Brutus, and really it is the fact that there's tension between this idea of state and federal responsibility. Why is it imperative that New Jersey acts now rather than waiting for a federal solution that might be decades away at this point?
Sure, and that's a great question. And I'll start off with a little story, and you'll see where I'm going. Maybe some of your listeners or some of your viewers today have seen the movie All the President's Men with Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman, who play the journalist Woodward and Bernstein, who investigated the basically the break-in at the Watergate Hotel, which led to the impeachment of President Richard Nixon and established many of the modern day laws and practices that we have to limit sort of the corruption of the presidency. Anyway, one of the sort of the more popular lines in popular culture comes from that movie, one that people take for granted, but don't realize that the origins of this phrase are from that movie. And the deputy director of the FBI, who was an undercover agent at the time, giving information to those journalists, would tell them repeatedly throughout the movie, follow the money, right? Follow the money. And a phrase that I want your listeners and your viewers to take is follow the harm. Okay? And by follow the harm, what I mean by that is that it was not just the federal government, but the state government and local government that were institutionally involved in reproducing harms against Black people. And so when we think about the responsibility for reparations, we should not only think about the federal government's involvement, we should think about the state's involvement, about municipalities' involvement, about corporations' involvement. We've got to follow the harm wherever it takes us. And that will lead us to the actors, the institutions, the government bodies, which were deeply involved and interconnected in reproducing harms. For example, the GI Bill is a federal bill, but it was purposefully passed in such a way to give administration of the GI Bill to the states because Southern Dixiecrats would not let the bill pass unless they could administer it in a racist way. Places like New Jersey also administered in a highly racist way, right? And so it was both the state and the federal government who were deeply involved, right? Police forces. Police forces are state entities, not federal entities. In New Jersey, like in other southern states, the police was created as an institution to police Black people, to police formerly enslaved people, right? And so it's the responsibility of the state government to repair the harms that were created by the over-policing of Black people, right? These slave codes in New Jersey, they started in the early 18th century, around 1704, which were incredibly harsh and similar to Southern slave codes, right? Those were state laws. Those were not federal laws, right? And so it is the responsibility of the state of New Jersey to repair those harms. And now I want also your listeners to understand that pursuing reparations at the state level does not mean you cannot pursue reparations at the federal level. You know, reparations advocates want it all, right? Because we understand the harms were vast, they were interconnected. And so the demand for reparations is not just at the state level, it's related to the federal level, it's related to corporations and universities and faith institutions, right? It's the interconnection between that creates the modern world, right? Just a few weeks ago, the president of Ghana brought a resolution to the UN making the claim that the trafficking of enslaved people in the Americas was the gravest crime against humanity. And what the writers and the thinkers who behind that resolution meant by the gravest crime was that chattel slavery in the Atlantic was a world-making and world-breaking institution. And what they meant by that, it created the modern world. And to do that, you had to involve all these institutions and actors and elements involved. And that New Jersey was part of that, right? New Jersey as a slave state of the North, or a quote unquote slave society, was created because the very infrastructure of New Jersey, the roads, the buildings, were made possible by the labor of enslaved Africans. Right? And so when we're talking about what responsibility does the state of New Jersey have, it has a tremendous amount of responsibility. And therefore, it cannot be excused from its obligation to repair those harms. But it also means that the United States government, as a federal institution, is required to repair those harms, as well as corporations, universities, as I said before, faith institutions, and the list goes on.
Thank you so much for highlighting the broad and shared sense of responsibility, because it's important to note many opponents to reparations often cite this idea that they have to shoulder their burden of the load in remitting or paying or exacting reparations for these harms, when in reality, it is really clear and it's extremely possible to directly link corporations, public agencies, local, state, and federal government, and how they have both benefited from and continue to perpetuate the harms that were rendered through these atrocious acts. I want to turn to you, Dr. Khalfani, and ask, looking through the sociological lens, reparations are often framed as a handout. Your work suggests that they are instead a reinvestment in human capital. So how does the current lack of repair act as a psychological and economic anchor on the entire New Jersey economy, not just the Black community?
Yeah, it's a great question. Also, I want to contextualize that in that I also sit on the African Union's Committee of Experts on Reparations. And I think that one of the things that our brother Brutus pointed to in terms of thinking about these things is that, you know, we have to see them in their both, we have to see them holistically. And I think sociologically, that's one of the things that we bring to the table is thinking about things from a holistic perspective. We're working on a framework that looks at, from the African Union perspective, is a draft framework that hasn't been formalized yet. We're in the process of formalizing it. But our whole premise is that a crime doesn't rot, right? And so that there's looking at it from an African-centered perspective, that from an African jurisprudence, if you will, that a crime doesn't rot means that there is no termination date of the consequences of these elements of white supremacy, right? These elements of enslavement. And this is why, you know, I was at the African Burial Ground when the president of Ghana was here, and our members who sit on our executive board were in Ghana when they were developing some of that language and contributed to it. So I think that we've got to see that part of the push to keep things the way they are is that there is a narrative that's being presented that suggests that you're not included in it, right? So you don't do repair because if I open the pathway to suggest that you have entree to the full table of discussion and engagement, that maybe you think of yourself in a different way. And these laws, these were these rules, these policies, the Constitution were drafted in such a way that people of African descent weren't included. Right. And so even though it said equality, even though it said justice for all, it didn't mean everybody. There was no everybody in that justice for all. It was for a particular group of European American men that was referring to. And until we come to terms with that, it's going to be very difficult for us to think about how we get to reparations, because the idea of repair means that we have to come to terms with what happened. Right. And I think that's why you had Ghana pushing this legislation, this resolution before the United Nations. And this is why you had so many people, so many countries, not only the three that voted against, but the others that voted or abstained from it, is that you had a denial of really accountability in dealing with it. And until we get to a place where we have people to address it fully and see their own ownership. And our brother Brutus, I want to add one piece to it. He talked about the corporate, the churches, the universities, but also the individuals, right? So there's all these families that benefited. And so we have to talk about all of them, right? And that the reason people don't want to talk about reparations is because it means that people have to give up some privilege that they've benefited from for decades. And some of the privilege you may even not even see or understand, right? So sociologists might say, someone may say, well, you know, I don't have any particular privilege, but it takes someone who's unraveling that to show you the privilege that you are receiving. Eduardo Bonilla Silva wrote a book called Racism Without Racist. And so you have all these people who say that they're not racist, but Bonilla Silva points out that even though they say that their actions exhibit racist actions. And if they don't see it, it's because their privilege of positionality has created a context for them to not be able to see the harm that they continue to cause. And if you don't understand or see the harm, then you operate in such a way that that you absolve yourself from it when someone brings it to your face, because you're not experiencing it. You don't think that you're part of it, but your every actions, your everyday life benefits from it. So if we look back at in the United States, when people moving to the West got 160 acres of land, these are European Americans, when they got 160 acres of land, how much generational wealth did that engender for people? Right. And to what extent are they still benefiting from that? And that was an exclusive thing for specific families and not others. So that itself is a specific way in which these mechanisms of the not just enslavement, but the ongoing crisis of wealth accumulation between African Americans and European American families sustain themselves. And we have to come to terms with and acknowledge that before we can move the needle to get to someplace else.
Wow. Thank you so much for those insights. I really appreciate your mentioning of the privilege of positionality, because it really breaks the mold of the fallacy where the idea that I didn't call it, why do I have to endure the process of enacting it, as well as those who indicate that, well, I'm not privileged, but privilege can be seen in positionality far beyond whether you somehow financially still benefit. But that is an incredible piece of insight that you've shared. And I want to ask one additional question for you, Dr. Akil. Sociologically speaking, how do we overcome the zero-sum myth? The idea that among some voters that repair for one group means a loss for another group.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's not that it's a loss; it's that it is addressing something that was caused. And I think Brother Bruce made the point is that it caused harm. And so how do we address that? You know, so if you go back and look, one of the things that we talk about in the document is that in 1952, the Luxembourg Agreement set up a position where Jewish Americans receive $845 million in compensation, which would be $18 billion today. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988 gave formal apology and $1.6 billion payment, $20,000 per person, to Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II. The Native American Trust Settlement included $3.4 billion in payments. And there's a further one that was $4.92 million a settlement for indigenous folks. And so it's not that these things haven't happened. It's just that once it's been presented for the benefit of people of African descent, that there still is some undergirthing disdain for people of African descent that we haven't really fully addressed. And so I wrote a book called The Hidden Debate, which looks at affirmative action in South Africa and the United States. And one of the things that we see in there is that the largest beneficiaries of affirmative action were European American women. However, they also fought against affirmative action. Why did they fight against the things that they were the largest beneficiaries of? Is because that there's still some anti-Black sentiment that has to be addressed. And until we address that specifically, it's going to be very difficult to get to the place that reparations is talking about if we don't address the anti-Black sentiment that exists in the United States and the microaggressions that occur along the way. All of these things are part and parcel of the things we have to look at.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the added context there. Mr. Hamm, Brother Larry, you've seen many study commissions. You've seen them come, and you've seen them go.
Mhm.
And throughout the entirety of that time, I'm sure that you have formulated some opinions, but you've seen that happen over 50 years. So I wonder, what is different about the current political climate, and what is the strategic role of the citizen, the viewers that are watching right now, in ensuring that this status report actually turns into a status change?
Well, thank you. And I thank my fellow panelists for their insightful remarks that I have gained from as a result of being here. Just as an introductory remark, just to set a kind of timeline. And I wanted to make a commercial. I want everybody to read, to get a copy, if you don't already have a copy, of The Nowness of Reparations. This is the report that the New Jersey Reparations Council produced after almost 2 years of work. Jean-Pierre played a major role in that, and many very well-known academics also played a role, and activists, in putting this report together. I really would urge everybody to get this report and read it. By reading this, you'll learn a great deal about slavery here in the state of New Jersey. It's not the only thing that's been written about slavery here in New Jersey, and there's a volume of work, but it is a very recent publication, and I think it's very prescient. So that's thing one. Thing two is it's important to understand how deeply intertwined the enslavement of Black people is with the founding of this country. New Jersey was a Dutch colony, I believe, formally recognized in 1620. And I think it was under the Dutch initially. And by 1625, African labor was being exploited in New Jersey. So from the beginning, it's important. You got to have this timeline. Like, this didn't start 100 years. Like, it was at the beginning, at the genesis of the United States as a white settler colonialist enterprise. The other thing to understand is that the enslavement of Africans precedes the founding of the American colonies and the British colonies here in North America. I mean, not even, we don't even have to go to the Caribbean. We could talk about the Spanish colony. People talk about 1619. That was Jamestown. That was an English colony, but the Spanish set up, what was it called? St. Augustine. In the 1500s, even South Carolina, the Spanish tried to set up a colony in South Carolina in the 1500s, and they brought enslaved African people. So we're talking about long before the establishment of the English colonies. Remember, as I said, New Jersey was, I believe, Dutch initially, and then, you know, the Dutch and the English were fighting it out. All these European powers were fighting it out for hegemony over the exploitation of the quote unquote New World, the Western Hemisphere, Caribbean and South America, and so on and so forth. There was slavery in Europe of Africans, even before Europeans crossed the Atlantic. There were plantations along the Mediterranean, other places. So it's important to grasp how old this institution is. And it helps to understand why it's so intransigent, so difficult to root out white supremacy. Because that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with racism and white supremacy. The genocide against the Native Americans, I mean, we can't forget that. and the enslavement of Africans that lasts. I mean, if we talk about the Western Hemisphere, we're talking about 400. If we're talking about slavery, we're talking about over 500 years of slavery in the Western Hemisphere. Because remember, initially they were enslaving the indigenous people, you know, and that didn't work out too well. So they went and got the Africans, because initially, you know, the theologians said Africans had no souls. This is what De las Casas said. He said, we shouldn't enslave the indigenous because they have souls, but we can enslave the Africans because they have no. This racism is very deep, going all the way back. It's very deep, you know, but that's a whole nother discussion. But I think it's important to have that context. The struggle for reparations has been going on. It's almost as old as enslavement is in the United States, but as a policy because there's the struggle for racial justice, and the struggle for racial justice is a multifaceted thing. It involves a lot, because a lot was done to us. And my position is the struggle for reparations is one facet of that multifaceted phenomena of racial injustice and its complement racial justice.
Indeed.
Jean-Pierre, you referred to Philip Foner. Philip Foner, in his discussion of the Civil War, discusses that critical moment that could have, in fact, changed the course of African-American history here in the United States. And that was the point where General Sherman issues Field Order, I believe it's 15, which expropriated, I think it was 400,000 acres of slave masters' land. And Sherman, by writ, this was not an act of Congress. This was a military order. By a declaration, issues a military order, says the cost of treason to the slave master is the expropriation of their land. And he gave that land to enslaved people. He met with leaders of the African-American community in South Carolina and said, what do y'all want? And they said, we want land. And that was thing one. And then Thaddeus Stephen comes along in Congress, part of the radical Republicans, and he issues H.R. 29, which says every enslaved person, I'm trying to remember if he said it was enslaved person or every person that fought in the Civil War. Well, anyway, African people would receive 40 acres and $50. Now, 40 acres is a lot of land. It doesn't sound like much, but if you know how big an acre is, 40 of those is a lot. And if every African person, every formerly enslaved or the survivor, the family survivors had received that 40 acres, it would have had a tremendous impact on the economic development of Black people in this country. It would have created a basis of generational wealth. And Foner says in his assessment right there that that was the most revolutionary proposal to come out of the Civil War. And the fact that that was quashed, I mean, several things happened. The assassination of Lincoln, not that Lincoln was necessarily the proponent of reparations, but Lincoln was the prosecutor of the Civil War. I mean, I think it's important for people to read Frederick Douglass's assessment of Abraham Lincoln. He wrote a whole speech on Lincoln. Read it. Douglass is an eyewitness. And for whatever faults Lincoln had, he saw the war through to the end. He broke the back of the Confederacy, of the slaveocracy. These were people who had committed treason. They literally tore the country apart in the name of the preservation of slavery. If you read every secession declaration of every state that was part of the Confederacy, they said, we're doing this to preserve white supremacy and slavery, because they saw themselves as the inheritors of the Revolutionary War. Because what? Because most of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were slave masters. And they were fighting the British. One of the major reasons they were fighting the British was so that they could preserve slavery here in the colonies.
Mm.
And this has implications for our celebration of the 250th anniversary. But let me get to the point that the question you asked me, Sophia. But I just felt, and see, the reason I'm saying this is because I support school desegregation. New Jersey has some of the most segregated schools. Well, I think we're like 5th or 6th in the nation in school segregation. I support school segregation, school desegregation. But I don't see school desegregation as reparations. I see it as racial justice, but I don't see it as reparation. Reparations is compensation for the wealth that was taken from us during our enslavement. And the irony of it is that slave masters got reparations. My friend that lives in Washington, D.C. called me the other day and said, Larry, you know, we have Emancipation Day in Washington, D.C. They actually have a day that they said city is closed, city offices is closed. The day that Lincoln, I think it was 1863, declared an end to slavery in the District of Columbia. But all the slave masters got compensated.
Yeah, they did.
Haiti had a revolution. It's the only. I grew up with Spartacus, right? With Kirk Douglas and Spartacus, you know. And I love Spartacus, but Spartacus failed.
Yeah.
And the Romans crucified 6,000 of Spartacus soldiers. Haiti is the only country in history where enslaved people set up their own country, overthrew their slave masters. They beat the French, who were the superpower at the time. But then Napoleon came back. See, people don't talk about this part, talk about Napoleon. He brought slavery back.
Yeah.
The great Napoleon brought slavery back and threatened Haiti with another war if they didn't pay reparations. They put reparations on Haiti. They made Haiti pay France back for their enslavement. And that debt didn't get paid off until 2015.
Yeah.
So,
and that is incredible.
Yes. So I knew, let me just say this. I'm gonna wind up. I was at Gary in 1972, the National Black Political Convention. I was the youngest elected delegate at Gary. And I met Queen Mother Moore then. So that's how I got introduced to the struggle for reparations. You know, and I've seen this struggle come a long way, come from being a marginal issue to, in fact, being a very central issue. As a matter of fact, just before Trump got reelected in 24, they were on the verge. They had enough votes to pass HR 40. But you know what happened in 24? Lost the White House, lost the House, and lost the Senate. And I think it's important to understand this facile relationship between politics and reparations. Reparations is a governmental act. You know, yes, there are white families who try to help the descendants of the Black people that their families enslaved. But in the final analysis, reparations is something a government has to do. And the government of New Jersey owes Black people reparations, and the government of the United States owes Black people reparations. And if we dig far enough, we'll probably see a lot of these municipalities had laws on the books that supported slavery. And so the reparations struggle has gone from becoming a marginal discussion to, in fact, a more mainstream discussion, but now it's in great danger because, you know, we have white supremacists unveiled running the country. I mean, the Republican Party essentially now is the party of white supremacy and fascism. Is there racism in the Democratic Party? Yes, there's racism in the Democratic Party. But the Republican Party has full embraced, opened its tent up to all these fascists and neo-fascists and Nazis and neo-Nazis and Confederates and neo-Confederates. And we have a president that speaks openly the most vile and racist comments I've ever heard a president say. That's not to say he's any more racist than they were, but he's saying the quiet part out loud. And he's saying it not just about Black people here in the United States, he's saying it about Black people all over the world. So I think that we have to continue to fight for reparations, even when it looks like we can't win. Because remember, there was a time when it looked like we wouldn't win the struggle against slavery. Slavery lasted damn 400 years, 250 years. But we kept fighting, we kept rebelling. People said, George Wallace stood in the doorway, said segregation now, segregation forever. It looked like we wouldn't, after they bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church, it looked like we wouldn't win the struggle against Jim Crow, but we won. And so we have to maintain, we have to stay involved and stay on course and continue to demand reparations for Black people, for the descendants of Africans enslaved in the United States and the Western Hemisphere.
Wow. Thank you so very much for painting such a vivid picture of the case for reparations, especially as it relates to the atrocities that continued even beyond the changing of laws, beyond the changing of those in power. Again, it is an institutional and systemic issue that we are talking about here.
And by the way, real quick, yesterday was the anniversary of the end of Reconstruction. Yesterday was the anniversary of Rutherford B. Hayes taking the last of the federal troops out of the South, out of Louisiana. And that was the end. That was the counter-revolution. You know, the Civil War was like a revolution, and then immediately there was a counter-revolution. I mean, immediately. I mean, one of the reasons we're in this shape today is because everybody, you know, there was no real, I think the only one, I don't even think they executed the president of the Confederacy. What was it, Jefferson Davis? I don't even think they executed Jefferson. These people committed treason. Over 1 million people were killed in the Civil War. 1 million Americans, more than in World Wars I, II, Vietnam, and Korea combined. And essentially, when it was over, people said, "Okay, let's make up. We all going to be friends now." And Black people get sold out because essentially that's what happened. The Rutherford, the Tilden Hayes Compromise. It was a sellout of Black people. And that's one of the reasons we're in this situation that we're in today. And this is the one lesson that I have learned in my life. I'm 72 now, is how intergenerational racism is, how it gets passed down from generation to generation. How even when we have victories, if we're not vigilant to maintain those victories, it'll be taken away in a minute.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right in that regard, especially as is evidenced by what we see, the removal of books, removal of the truth, which combats the lies that continue to be told generationally. The progress is thereby hindered and even eradicated in some regards. I want to turn to you, Jean-Pierre, for one additional question. For the young activists in Newark and in Plainfield and the surrounding area who feel that the system is too broken to fix through councils and legislation, what is your message regarding the intersection of street protest and policy negotiation?
Sure. So thank you for that question, and I appreciate Larry's previous conversation. What I would say to those young activists and those young folks the relationship between the policy and what happens within the halls of legislators or legislatures across the state and in the state house in Trenton, and sort of the organizing, the advocacy happening in the streets, both in terms of community meetings and on the roads, is to first the most sort of subtle and in many ways, how can I put this? Yeah, the most subtle but sort of nefarious form of power is the idea that you cannot oppose it. The idea that things are the way they are, and they're there because it's natural. It's there because this is how it was made, and it's how it will always be, right? One. And so understanding that it takes a lot of effort, time, and energy to maintain the status quo, one. And then two, what the status quo and those in power want to do is prevent the possibility of you thinking about alternatives, that things can be different than the way they are, right? And so one, I would always urge young folks and folks younger than me to think about and retain always an imagination. Larry brought up the Haitian Revolution, and it is the scholar C.L.R. James in his book The Black Jacobins in 1938 that talks about, and Du Bois talks about this in Black Reconstruction in 1935, and others have pointed this out, is that Black people who were enslaved always retained the imagination, the capacity to dream about freedom. And this is what will help them to organize. So when I would say to young activists is always look to history and always think about the folks that came before them that were doing this work in circumstances that were tremendously difficult. But two, the relationship between social movements, activism on the street, and policy change. Think about, I think people hold this up as the primary example, but think about the 1960s and the civil rights movement. Think about the relationship between the organizing that was done and then the relationship between how that turned into policy changes like the 64 Civil Rights Act, the 65 Voting Rights Act, the 68 Fair Housing Act, right? And this was the work of many, 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 many groups and activists who were thinking about Black liberation, who were thinking about ending segregation, who were thinking about how to reorganize democracy so that Black people could participate in a different kind of way than they previously had not, right? And so there is a direct relationship between the activism on the street, thinking about what kind of concrete goals you have in terms of policy changes, right? You may not have the sort of specific legal language, but you may know that you want a specific kind of policy outcome. You may want to address a specific kind of issue that is addressing your communities, right? You may think that, okay, we're interested in sort of health equity. We're addressing in particularly sort of the disparities in Black maternal health outcomes, or we're interested in the over-policing of Black people, and there's a specific set of policies that we want, right? And thinking about what you do in terms of organizing, putting pressure on your legislators, meeting with them, doing kinds of kind of demonstrations. Larry Hamm, the People's Organization for Progress, have been doing this for a long time now, right? And it's thinking about the kinds of actions that will have an effect. And, even just calling a legislator is a big step because, they are persuaded by folks calling on a specific bill, listening to them, right? You would be surprised when you hear local state lawmakers saying, I got a number of phone calls about this specific bill, about the Reparations Task Force. Maybe I think I should be supporting it. They will, if you're a constituent, they will feel that pressure. So thinking about doing an organized campaign to requesting a meeting, those things happen. You are a constituent. Remember that there's power in being a constituent, being a voter. Also, in terms of, I just want to go back to this idea of thinking about the possibilities and the realities of what folks think are impossible. Larry talked about how enslavers received reparations. I want to point out here in New Jersey from 1806 to 1811, enslavers in New Jersey received reparations from the state of New Jersey. Under the period of gradual abolition, quote unquote, in New Jersey, enslavers in New Jersey received payments from the state to first, quote unquote, take care of the folks that they had, quote unquote, freed. But really, in gradual abolition, New Jersey was not a change in actual living conditions for enslaved people, but it's a change in title from enslaved to apprentice. But yet the state almost went bankrupt paying money to enslavers because of the value of enslaved labor. So I just want to point out here in New Jersey, the specificity of reparations being paid to enslavers. And also, I just want to maintain that there is a relationship between organizing, mass protests, and policy change. We saw that. We have documented evidence throughout American history, particularly in the 1960s, but even before, in that relationship and ongoing. And so I just want folks to know that that can shift the conversation, the way in which lawmakers understand the framing and continue to put pressure, because I know that our democracy is on the edge. It's teetering, but there is still a tremendous amount of possibility within people power, with people being organized and with keeping up the work, right? Things aren't going to happen overnight, but if you continue to organize, continue to advocate, things will change, right? And power, will not change without demand. You use the Frederick Douglass line, right? It concedes nothing without a demand. Well, that requires organization, that requires consistency, and that requires hard work. And things can change, certainly.
Thank you so much for those insights. It certainly is incredible to understand that power is something that's in the hands of citizens today, but it does require organization. It requires persistence, diligence, and, as Brother Larry mentioned, vigilance, because staying the course consistently is necessary if we are to move beyond the status quo, which we see today. Dr. Pruszinski, I want to ask, if the legislature passes a study but no funding, is that progress, or is it a stall tactic?
That's a great question. Honestly, the unfortunate fact is that a lot of the things that get offered as possibilities are stall tactics, right? I mean, absolutely. If the study bill gets passed but it's not funded, that's absolutely a stall tactic, essentially because it needs money behind it in order to make it happen. And I know that the Reparations Council has done its own study, and so to some degree, a lot of the work has already been done. But this is like a very common tactic. There, like another tactic that you sort of see is kind of like, saying yes to reparations in name, but just renaming what you're already doing and calling it reparations. Like a lot of the institutions that I'm familiar with have done this kind of thing, where they sort of rename funds that they're already deploying and call it reparations. Obviously, that's not reparations, but that's kind of, one of these standard tactics to sort of minimize the effects on the entrenched sort of system of power and system of privilege. And unfortunately, I think that's an absolutely accurate kind of observation about that bill.
Yeah, indeed. And to your point, the renaming, the reattributing that which is already earmarked to citizens who were historically marginalized certainly is not changing situations or conditions, nor is it pushing the dial toward the equity that is really necessary to ensure reparations are achieved. Jean-Pierre, how do we define success for the 2026 to 27 fiscal year as it relates to reparations?
Yeah, that's an important question and a great one. And one of the things I think that marks success, and there are many successes, and one of the things I would ask your audience to think about is to use a sports analogy. We are in the middle of the NBA playoffs, right? And think about this. In an NBA season, there's the exhibition season, right? The preseason, there's the regular season, there's the playoffs, and there's the championship. You have different types of wins. You've got wins in the exhibition, which are not the same as wins in the regular season, which are not the same as wins in the playoffs, which is not the same as a win in the championship, right? And each win has a sort of different meaning and a different level of celebration that comes with it. And so we've got to take the small wins along with the big wins, right? And so winning in 2026, 2027 means shifting the conversation so that more legislators are talking about reparations. More folks around the state are aware of slavery in New Jersey. So 56% of people in New Jersey, we did a study with Rutgers-Eagleton. And what we found was that 56% of folks in New Jersey simply don't know that slavery happened in the state. There's just a tremendous amount of basic ignorance that people are unaware of slavery in the state of New Jersey. So when I give talks to people, I will ask folks, folks who grew up in New Jersey if they learned about slavery in New Jersey. And usually it's, in a group of 50, 60 people, you might get 2 or 3 people who raise their hands, right? And so one of the basic things we had to do is public education, spreading the word and the knowledge. Also, what we're trying to do is introduce legislation that would have the state of New Jersey formally apologize through the law for slavery in New Jersey, right? And we hope to get the Homicide Commission curriculum to include the findings of the New Jersey Reparations Council report. So getting that introduced, getting legislators to support that piece of legislation, getting constituents to call their legislators in support of that. I think that's important. And then also spreading public education and awareness, right? We need the truth. We need to tell the truth, and the truth to power in order for repair to happen. We need both truth and repair. And so the truth about slavery in New Jersey, the truth about white supremacy and racism in New Jersey through Jim Crow, through segregation, through redlining, through these practices up to the current moment, right? Spreading that awareness. And then also what we've seen globally and internationally, right? My colleagues on this panel talked about the work done at the international level through the UN, the work done at the national level with my colleagues at the Why We Can't Wait Network, who are advocating for HR 40, and then my colleagues in states and local municipalities across this nation, in California, in Illinois, in the South, in the Midwest, in the Northeast, who are doing this work and changing the narrative around reparations so that reparations is seen as common sense and commonplace. So when people are thinking about the racial wealth gap, incarceration rates, the life expectancy gap, all these different kinds of inequalities, when they think about what do we need to do to address that, the word and the concept of reparations comes to mind. No longer is reparations, as Larry pointed out, something that's on the margins, that's something that's associated with only certain kinds of advocates. It's now become mainstream. It's seen as the vehicle for making this kind of change happen around racial justice, around Black liberation. And so I think one of the things that, a win in 26 and 27 is for reparations to become much more common sense, much more commonplace. And then also for the knowledge and awareness of slavery in New Jersey to become much broader here in the state, because we're not going to get repair. We're not going to get reparations if folks don't even know that slavery happened here in the state and people aren't even aware of New Jersey's responsibility. And so getting that 56% number lowered is a big step forward.
Absolutely true. Thank you so very much for those insights there. Dr. Khalfani, Dr. Akil, we talk about repairing the breach. How much of that repair must be cultural and educational versus strictly financial? Now, we know, obviously, monies are available. We've seen, as it was even purported today, reparations were paid to enslavers. We've also seen significant, tremendous, unprecedented transference of wealth back into the hands of the ultra wealthy through legislation. So yes, that underscores the need for reparations to include that financial element. But what about the cultural and educational aspects? How much must be rendered through those avenues?
Yeah. So a couple of things here. One is that in reference to the educational piece, when Brother Bruce just mentioned about the Amistad legislation, I would push that, and I've said this to Bill Payne and others. I think the shortcoming with the Amistad legislation, even I mentioned this at the 9th Pan-African Congress in Togo last year, was that it's not in the testing. So if you're pushing for new legislation to change the Amistad legislation, it means nothing if it's not in the testing. So you got to make sure that if we're pushing to have this document or elements of it included into the curriculum, that the Amistad legislation was passed in 2003, 2002, whatever it was. It's been on the books ever since then. But tell me how many schools throughout the entire state of New Jersey, which has over 600 school districts, actually implement the Amistad legislation. And you probably would find on your hand, maybe your pinky, where it's fully implemented in throughout the entire state. And so the reason why it's not is that, everything is geared towards the test. And if the state test doesn't require it, it's not going to happen. So my point is, put it in the state test, make it a requirement at that level. That way, school districts, teachers are all going to mandate it and teach it in a way that is comprehensive, regardless of the school district, because they want their students to perform well on those tests. The other thing is that as we think about reparations in the way that you're asking this question, is that for the African Union Committee of Experts on Reparations, one of the things that we're building on, and I think that was mentioned about other international bodies, that you got to look at the CARICOM. CARICOM has really kind of pushed the envelope the furthest on reparations, and we oftentimes only look insularly, and I think we shortchange ourselves because their level of agreement, their level of analysis from the presidential level all the way down to everyone else engaged has taken the discussion further than anybody else has taken it. And we need to use that as a basis for our educational, political, curriculum way of understanding it. And one of the things that we did in the committee at the African Union Committee was that we talked about what is the internal reparations that we need to think about, right? How do we address the embedded nature of white supremacy that has affected us culturally? Things that we think are cultural but are actually oppressive, right? And so then until we address those things, Naim Akbar wrote a book called Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery. Until we begin to start looking at these kinds of ideas, these concepts, and understand the embedded nature of what imperialism was all about, what breaking the mind of the enslaved person was all about. Think about this, that they, you go back and watch the movie Roots, and the whole thing was psychological to get Toby to be Toby, right? And he was saying, no, I'm Kunta Kinte. He said, so the struggle has always been to get you to be Toby. And until we understand that that brain dirtying, not brainwashing, brainwashing means to clean, that brain dirtying has affected us mentally for centuries, that then we need some brainwashing, wash out all that confusion of oppression and white supremacy. We got to wash all those things out of our brains so that we can restore our African understandings of the word. Things that we can do with that is that even in the idea of governance, we spend time talking about democracy, but we have our own senses of ideas, cultural, political, social, historical ways of thinking and doing that you could look at. For instance, Mbongi. Mbongi is a traditional African idea about governance. Baba Fukiao wrote a book on it. And if you look at Mbongi, it begins us a place to think about what we think about. That's that we want to be thinking about how reparations is that crime does not rot, right? And so then that gives us the foundation of thinking about and operationalizing what we do and how we do it. The Africana Institute this year is celebrating its 25th anniversary. Our theme next year is on reparations. And so we're going to spend a whole year, the 26-27 academic year, focusing on reparations. Momentum helps us to contextualize that, to look at all the ways in which, culturally, politically, spiritually, we need to think about all these things. Larry had mentioned a great point about Haiti, but Haiti didn't win because it just had more weapons than the French. Haiti didn't win because they had more cannons, because they had more soldiers. Haiti won because of their way of thinking about their own liberation, because of their spiritual foundation, using their spiritual systems. Haiti won because they had a mission that was bigger than them as a country, as a people. So once they won, what did they do? They went and started, they minted their own coins. They helped other countries get free from slavery. They told African people in the Americas and wherever else that they got to Haiti that they would be free. And thousands of African Americans went to Haiti. We don't talk about that. People things are about this kind of cultural, political, social understanding of. And so we celebrate those things. And as being 25 years in the Africana Institute at Essex County College, 25 years in looking at African history, culture and development, we've positioned ourselves so that we come at this in a holistic way. And a shameless plug, we're celebrating our 25th anniversary on May the 14th, and that's going to be a celebration. We invite you all to come and join us on May the 14th, because we are here, and that's if you go to the website, you'll see it as www.sankofa25, www.essex.edu at Sankofa25. But the point here is that if we really want to be about transforming how we do what we do, we've got to know that part of the problem has been the manipulation of the African mindset and the cultural warfare that we're up against and have been that way ever since. You can even see that in the Native Americans, where kids were taken out of their homes and taken to these places where they couldn't speak the language, they couldn't do anything, and all those things are what we did as well. So we have to see the places where we fought against that. Larry said that the slavery, that people fought against slavery from the very beginnings. This was also true in every aspect of it. So when you look at the United States and where people of African descent were practicing their spiritual systems, that they use that as a tool for battling against white supremacy and enslavement. So they had the drums, they had conjure, they had hoodoo, they had all these different systems that helped them to deal with the baggage of a slaveocracy. There was a total system. Slaveocracy was a total system because it was in every aspect. Everybody that was for slavery benefited from it in all the ways that they could, individually, politically, culturally, institutions, and even what they may call them parastatals now, things that were private and public, the mergers together. So all of those places had benefits from the institution of slavery. And so they adopted measures that created division. So here, and I'll kind of end on this. One of the main things that was done was the whole idea of divide and conquer. If you look at divide and conquer, that is the place at which the core of the systems would cause people to work against their brothers and sisters, would cause people to work against their own best interests. Because if you, my great-great-great-grandmother, in the 1930s, the Federal Works Project had these narratives of people who were enslaved, and my great-great-great-grandmother was one of those narratives. And in that narrative, she talks about how she doesn't use this word, but how the psychological and cultural manipulation of people made it so that you lived in fear. And so we still have fear that plagues us today. She said that one time the slave master had watched the slave master pull this woman who was what they called a house girl, somebody who worked in the house. And when she came out, there was a bell that would ring if she opened the door. And so the slave master came out and saw a piece of a pickle on the floor and told her to strip naked and beat her half to death for a pickle that he didn't know if she had taken or not. But because the potential of her having taken it, he beat her to that point. But it was psychological because he was trying to make her an example. And the example that she was for anybody else who might think to do something that, just might feed them, that you couldn't do that unless you were given permission to. So those are those systems of fear are the things that we still have to rid ourselves with. Some people still live in fear. You can't walk down the street, especially in the South. Sometimes people still walk down the street, especially older folks. You can't look white folks in the eye. because that, you cross the street or you move over to make way for people who are people of European descent. Still happens to this day. And these are the kinds of things that we have to think about that continue to plague our community, and the history of racial relations that we have to think about. How does that impact the possibility of reparations coming into being?
Yeah, and it's so very important. As one important takeaway from what you've shared is identity and how it matters. The ability for us to reclaim our identity and hold to that is the means by which we will truly achieve self-actualization. Otherwise, it becomes a distant target which continues to move as our identity is stripped and is further distanced from where we stand in our position in society today. And so I appreciate those insights. And I want to turn really quickly to you, Dr. Pruszinski, to ask, how do you see the outlook for the near future at the intersection of religion and reparations? And I ask this, of course, with the understanding and the recall that many of the institutions that we've come to trust were leveraged to, in fact, achieve and sustain slavery, such as religious institutions, the faith, and the distorted views that were extrapolated from the Bible, because truly being able to read for many years was not something that could be achieved, certainly not through freedom or through the law that was in place at the time. But yes, I'll turn to you for that question, Dr. Brzezinski.
Thanks, President Jenkins. I do think that there is reason for some hope with respect to religious institutions. As everyone on this panel probably recognizes, most religious institutions are by nature conservative, being institutions. So they're very slow to change. But I'll just sort of offer a little bit of sort of hope from the institution that I'm sort of most familiar with, which is the Episcopal Diocese of New Jersey. All right, so this is the Episcopal Church is the denomination that came out of the Anglican Church in the United States after the colonial era, and so our diocese has a very long history of racism. And it has a very long history with sort of collaborating with and benefiting from the systems of privilege related to slavery and the very kinds of deeply problematic systems of sort of racist systems of wealth accumulation. In the 1990s, we had a bishop in our diocese who was ousted, which is actually a very unusual situation, in part because of racist incidents that he had perpetuated and engaged in. And the historically Black churches of our diocese engaged in a walkout of our diocesan convention in order to try to leverage their power. They withheld their diocesan giving in order to try to sort of induce the rest of the majority white churches, majority white diocese, to care about this. And it only sort of worked at the time. It took a lot of other things, of deep, problematic, in many cases, like entirely unethical behavior on the part of that bishop for them to be ousted. The racism wasn't an adequate reason at the time. And then, there's like a big kind of, he had to have a sort of severance payout. A lot of the white churches in the diocese were resented the fact that they were on the hook for paying for this long term, even though they hadn't even felt like they wanted to get rid of him. And so this is a diocese where there's sort of a longstanding racial tension in a number of different ways. This was recognized. A number of very committed anti-racist Episcopalians in the diocese started anti-racism training, and we sort of have been working on that for decades now. Even so, in spite of lots of work on anti-racist trainings, even 10 years ago, there was the sort of initiative that was taken to try and start a reparations task force in the diocese. It was voted down by the sort of democratic body of the diocese. There was not enough interest. But after the George Floyd protests, this was a resolution that was reintroduced, and it was overwhelmingly voted in favor to have a reparations task force. Okay, so enough happened with the first Trump administration, with the George Floyd protests, to raise the awareness among white Episcopalians in our diocese that this was a serious problem and actually needed to be addressed, that they actually were willing to overwhelmingly support this resolution. And that task force was begun. It was made into a commission. We've been working now for a few years, and we've been trying to educate the diocese to sort of do this history work, to do this process of raising awareness of all this New Jersey history, all of this really racist diocesan history. And only just this past fall, the commission brought another resolution to the diocesan convention, this democratic body of the diocese, requesting that we establish a reparative justice trust, okay, with dedicated funds to engage in the process of paying on an ongoing basis reparative justice funds to the historically Black churches in our diocese. This was passed with over 95% of the convention in favor, which is overwhelming support, right? Even so, before that, there were all of these very well-positioned, influential, elite members of the leadership of the diocese who were saying, no, it's not going to work. No, don't bring that resolution. No, you shouldn't. It's going to fail. They were wrong, okay? But they had reason to believe, based on the systems of power and privilege, that they weren't wrong, okay? So these systems hold on longer to power than they think they really have it. And we all often are willing to accord them the belief that they actually do still hold the power, even when they've actually functionally lost it. And it takes pushing to actually realize they've actually lost the power. Now, the Episcopal Church is the only majority white denomination that did not vote overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. It actually voted for Kamala Harris in the most recent election. So to some degree, this is not entirely representative of white denominations in the United States, but the Diocese of New Jersey is a pretty conservative Episcopal diocese. So I do think that there's actually like a lot of reason to be encouraged. The board that's going to oversee these funds is in the process of deciding how the fund is going to be populated, but there is movement. Okay, and this is not at a governmental level, this is at a faith institution level. But the idea is that this is going to be making really significant changes on a financial level for the historically Black congregations that have been systematic victims of these wealth disparities in the diocese. And the diocese has been actually, part of that problem in perpetuating that difficulty. So this is meant to undo that. But then there's also going to be other systemic issues that are addressed, including, disproportionate obstacles to ordination for Black candidates, and a number of other governance things. So I do think there's reason to be encouraged, even as it's perhaps too much to say this is a bellwether. I do think that there's reason to hope. And the main thing is that the entrenched powers and elite power brokers and gatekeepers typically think they have power longer than they actually do.
Yeah, incredible points there. And certainly the progress that we're seeing with that sect is great to see, because obviously any extent of progress certainly fuels the hope that is needed to then drive the change needed on a broader scale. So I appreciate those insights, and certainly thank you to your leadership with the Reparations Council in the diocese and ensuring that these topics remain central to the conversation and the strategies as you move forward in your efforts. I want to turn to everyone really quickly as the time begins to draw near. I want to give you all an opportunity to share closing remarks. And as you're preparing to do that, I invite you also to share your favorite song as it relates to the struggle that we continue to remain embattled in, but are slowly beginning to see that we're positioned to be empowered in to endure and overcome. So your favorite song as it relates to the topic and your closing remarks. I'll start with you, Brother Larry Hamm.
Thank you, President Jenkins. Once again, thank you for having me on this panel. My deepest gratitude to my fellow panelists, from whom I learned a great deal today. Let me say, first of all, going back to your original question that you asked me about the historical development of the reparations movement, in terms of the contemporary situation, I think one of the big successes we had was in the United Nations. This past, I think it was last week, there was a vote on the United Nations on a resolution stating that slavery was the greatest crime against humanity, and the resolution passed. It passed with 125 countries in favor. And I think that's a significant development, you know, that a majority of people in the world see slavery as a great crime against humanity. And I was very saddened, although not surprised, to see that our country was among the 3 countries that voted. There were only 3 that voted against the resolution. That was the United States, Israel, and Argentina. I think this was a stain on the reputation of the United States. Once again, pointing out the hypocrisy. We in Iran right now, talking about we're going to save democracy in Iran and we're going to protect protesters in Iran, and we don't even have true democracy here in the United States. But I would commend the president of Ghana, who I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Khalfani, I believe his name is President Mahama of Ghana, for bringing forward the resolution on reparations. So that was a significant vote. I think people should write their Congress people and say what an outrage it was that this country that enslaved Black people, if we talk about the continental United States for over 250 years, would vote against a resolution recognizing the crime of enslavement against Africans as a crime against humanity, which is one of the highest crimes, you know, that exist. But again, it's essential to understand the white supremacist, settler, colonialist history of the United States and how recalcitrant the position is from generation to generation. So that was a victory. I think the fact that California passed a law establishing their reparations commission, that was a victory. Followed by New York State last year. I believe it was in 2025, right? Or maybe 2024, that New York established their reparations commission. Now, if California and New York can establish their reparations commission, why can't New Jersey establish a reparations commission? Also, we had those victories in the United Nations, in California, in New York. I think also we should examine what happened in Maryland. It does not comport with what happened. I mean, here you had California with a white governor, predominantly white legislature, New York with a white governor, predominantly white legislature. they passed the law and established a reparations commission, each of those states. Maryland has a white-dominated legislature, but has a black governor. The legislature passed the resolution to establish a reparations commission. The black governor, Wes Moore, vetoed the resolution on establishment of a reparations commission. But then the Black Caucus came back and overrode. I mean, they got the legislature, I believe, to override Wes Moore's veto. Now, this I'm not going to discuss it here. We're at the end of the program. But this situation requires examination, because we elect Black people with the presumption that they're going to carry out the interests of the Black community. And then some of them get in positions of power and don't always act in that way. Now, Wes Moore gave a rationale, saying essentially that, we've studied enough. Now let's get to the work. Well, God darn it, if you can't get a reparations bill passed, what makes you think you're going to get a bill passed that's going to close the wealth gap between white and Black families? I mean, it's incredulous. It's incredulous. So here in New Jersey, we still have the reparations study bills. They have been reintroduced in the Assembly. The bill is A1665. It's been introduced by Assemblywoman Verlina Reynolds Jackson. A1665. In the Senate, Senator Angela McKnight has reintroduced the reparations bill as S2838. So I would urge everybody to support this. Now, how do you support this legislation? Well, for instance, we have primary elections coming up in June. There are going to be candidates forums. There are going to be people coming around asking for your vote. When they do, you should ask them, do you support reparations? Do you support the New Jersey establishing the reparations task force and passage of the task force legislation? And people need to find out if their senator and their assembly person are co-sponsors on the bill. When a bill is sponsored, there's a whole page for co-sponsors. You should demand that the people who represent you in the state legislature are co-sponsors on that bill. We should be demanding that the entire congressional delegation of New Jersey are because just as you have an assembly bill and a Senate bill in the state legislature, you have a House bill and a Senate bill in the Congress for HR 40. There's a Senate 40 and there's HR 40. And those bills need to be passed. Reparations is not, we're not going to talk reparations into being. In the final analysis, we're going to have to vote. And I know a lot of folks have negative impact about voting. I mean, negative perspective on voting, but it's not, we're not going to wish it into being, y'all. And just because we have a forum or we have a program or we write our own study, that's not going to make these people produce reparations. They must be compelled, and they will be compelled by political power. They will be compelled knowing that you know how they are going to vote on this bill. And if they don't vote accordingly, there is a price to pay. And it's really ironic because we could say now, well, we know reparations not going to make it through the Congress because the MAGA people control the Congress. Trump and his fascist movement control the House. They control the Senate. They control the Supreme Court. All that is true. But how do you explain New Jersey, where we have had for several cycles now a Democratic majority assembly, a Democratic majority Senate, and a Democrat in the governor's office. The fact that we can't even get them to sign off on a study commission, this ain't the real reparations. This is not the bill that says we're setting aside so many billions to provide reparations to the descendants of slaves. This is the study commission. And even though we've done a study commission, the state is not going to appropriate money without its own study. It's not going to happen. That's not how it works. They're going to do their own study, and we could probably get our study introduced as part of the evidence and so on and so forth. But how do you explain that when Black people have saved the Democrats in 2 elections? Chitterelli almost beat Murphy. Election before last, they both had 1 million votes. Black votes put Murphy over the top. And Black votes put Sherrill over the top. And we can't even get a study. This is disgraceful. And I know people don't like to hear that kind of talk, but facts is facts. You might not agree with all my opinions, but here are the facts. We can't get a study commission out of a committee. We can't get it to the floor for a vote. And this is why people need to read this book here. Dr. King, where do we go from here? Chaos or community? Dr. King says we must build workman-like organizations that have compelling power. Dr. King said an agenda is not enough. You have to have the power to compel people to implement the agenda. And that's what we're lacking now. You know, so I say let's continue to push for reparations. Let's continue to do education is key. Jean-Pierre pointed that out with the poll showing people don't even know slavery happened in New Jersey. But people don't know a lot of stuff. You know, it's very interesting how whenever it comes to Black people, folks have to be all knowing. They got to know everything. But everybody else gets stuff passed. We don't even know that the bills got passed until they've been passed. All kinds of benefits for corporations, all kinds of tax breaks, all kinds of deregulation. Nobody gets passed. But when it comes to Black issues, everybody got to be a historian. And that's a problem. So let's build this movement and let's continue to fight for reparations for the descendants of Africans in this country and throughout the Western Hemisphere. Reparations now.
Yes, indeed, indeed. And as it relates to that, I just want to remind all of you, we're also looking in relation to the movement, your favorite songs. So what would you share there, Brother Larry?
Man, you asking my favorite song. I don't know what I've had a lot of favorite songs. My favorite musician is Gil Scott-Heron. Gil Scott-Heron even did a song about reparations. You know, I like the Chai Lights. For God's sake, we got to give more power to the people. That's an old song, you know, but it still rings true. I like any musician that's trying to use their craft to bring a positive message to our people. I was in a press conference the other day, and we were talking about this demonstration on May Day that we're having, and the president of the Longshoremen's Union got up. His name is Buddy Smith. He's the president of Local 1233 Longshoremen, and he got up and said, you know, I remember that song by Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, featuring Teddy Pendergrass. Wake up, everybody. Wake up. No more sleeping in bed. No more backward thinking. Time for thinking ahead. So I'll go with that.
Okay. All right. Certainly appropriate for the moment and the compelling and overwhelming work that is ahead for the movement. Next, we're going to turn to you, Jean-Pierre. Please, your favorite song and your closing remarks as we prepared to end today's broadcast.
No problem. So for my closing remarks, what I would say to folks is, first, please go to njisj.org, to the New Jersey Council, New Jersey Institute's website, to find out more about the Institute's work. And if you want to find out more specifically about the work of the New Jersey Reparations Council, go to njreparationscouncil.org. You can find a copy of the report there. Also, if you would like a physical copy, reach out to justice@njisj.org, and we will send you a physical copy of the report. That's justice, once again, at njisj.org. And for my closing remarks, I just want to briefly thank you, Larry, for putting up the copy of the book. Briefly, I just want to go back to the point made about the UN resolution and about this idea of slavery being this kind of world-breaking and world-remaking institution. And the reason why I want to bring that up, and I can't stress this enough, is that we are living in the world that slavery made. Right? The very language that we use, our very ways of being. My colleague earlier talked about the fear that Black people face, the way in which they comport themselves, the way they conduct themselves, the white people around white people, looking down to the ground, shrinking their shoulders, right? Down to your very sense of being, your very sense of understanding of oneself, the way in which our societies are organized, right? That is the world that was made by slavery, right? And repairing that requires tremendous amounts of power to create a new world, a new sense of being, a new way of being, right? And that's, it requires building, creating something new, something different, moving forward. And so we look to the past, right? To the time before enslavement, to those who organized, who have been doing this work for centuries. Slavery started in 1441, right? And ended in 1888 in Brazil, right? That was over 440 years, right? And so we must think about, when you look on the cover of that report, the Sankofa, to go back and get it, looking to the ancestors, right? And looking to those that came before us, understanding our place in this current struggle, and thinking about how we are going to be good ancestors in the future. And so for my, in terms of my song, music, popular culture, expressive art are so important to Black liberation, to Black people organizing, to thinking about the future, right? And to take a cue from the late political scientist Richard Iden, talking about not just political songs that have a political message, but the love song. And the love song is something that is revolutionary, and the power of that. But I do want to take a cue from one of my favorite artists, what some would call the philosopher Robert Nesta Marley. And there are two songs. One is One Drop. Feel it in the one drop, he says. And then also So Much Things to Say Right Now, about knowing your place in the struggle, right? And when the rain falls, it doesn't fall on one man's housetop. Remember that. And so I just want to take those two songs as some of my favorite music as part of this struggle. And I appreciate your time in the audience and everyone for listening. And thank you to you all. And thank you so much for having me this afternoon. I appreciate it.
And a hearty thank you to you too, Jean-Pierre, Dr. Brutus. It certainly is an incredible task at hand. The strategies that have been discussed on today certainly will be paramount to our ability to overcome the resistance to righting these wrongs, repairing these harms. But more importantly, I think it's going to help to ensure that whatever work is done, that there's a lens of sustainability around it, and something that we can continue to uphold long into the future, with a brighter future for everyone, a more equal, a more just and equitable future. I'm going to turn now to you, Dr. Pruszinski. Again, your favorite song, and please, your closing remarks.
Thank you so much. For some reason, I think my video is not working well, so I'm actually going to go off video and just do audio. Can you hear my audio?
Yes, and your video is working well for the stream. It may just be your display.
Okay, super. Then I'll just not look at myself and we'll be great. So thank you so much to fellow panelists. Really such an enlightening time. I want to recognize Larry's comment that everybody's a historian in these kind of situations. And so I'm going to tamp down my history stuff. But I guess I just want to end with the idea that, want to encourage everybody to sort of think carefully about initiatives that maybe sound like reparations in word or on paper, but aren't in deed. Because a lot of the things that the sort of institutional gatekeepers want to let through in order to sort of allow a win for organizers are things that don't meaningfully change things. And I've seen this at a number of institutions that I've been related to. One example is in the Church of England, church commissioners run one of the largest endowments in the world. And a kind of reparations initiative there was actually brought by their risk managers in order to essentially avoid a larger problem later. And so they basically decided to dedicate 1% of funds of one of the largest endowments in the world to reparations, but then they're only doing grant making out of 1% of the 1%. And so it's essentially in many ways not very reparative, and they're still sitting on the bulk of the money. And so I just want to encourage everybody to be, thinking carefully about how we throw our weight behind things, because sometimes what's getting presented as reparations doesn't do a lot of repair work. And I'll just share briefly, I don't know that this is my favorite song, but it's a song that I really have appreciated that lately in the work that I've been doing. I Need You to Survive. Stand with me, agree with me. We're all part of God's body. It's his will that every need be supplied. You are important to me. I need you to survive. Not just God, but fellow believers, brothers and sisters. I've found this really meaningful. So thank you all for all of your contributions today. I'm really grateful to have gotten to be a part of this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pruszinski, both for your incredible work and the insights you shared on today. I want to round up as we come to the closing moments of today's broadcast with Dr. Akil. Again, please, your favorite song and your closing remarks for our listening audience.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, I have lots of songs. I like Brother Larry Hamm's comment about Gil Scott-Heron. I think that Gil has provided us with ample food for thought and tools to think of in terms of the struggle, and tools are important. However, one song I'll say that I'll let us think about today is Public Enemy's Fight the Power. Right, we got to continue to fight the power and recognize that there is a fight, right, and that there, as Brother Brutus said, that was amazing. Frederick Douglass in saying that there's no struggle, there's no progress. Kwame Ture also said that you got to organize. I've been to many events with Kwame Ture, and that's what he always talked about, is us organizing. And we need to think about how we organize and what that means. It means organizing in a global way. I want to just share here. These are a few books on reparations that I think that insights, and we've got to use everything at our disposal in the fight. All these books, the ways in which we're talking about it, and be global in it, right? So that part of our push for even with dealing with working with the African Union is that the African Union's push for reparations agenda has got to be about African jurisprudence. Somebody at the comments was talking about jurisprudence. We're thinking about, we use the word jurisprudence because that's kind of how some folks are going to position it. We got to have a political power. We got to talk about global coordination. So it's got to be Africans in America, but also all over the globe. We've got to include all of our folks that have been pushing for reparations to talk about what reparations is going to be and how we're going to put the pressure to bring it into fruition. So I don't necessarily think, HR 40 is about another study. When I ran for Congress in 2020 and 2022, I talked about a another study. I understand Brother Larry's point, but we also have to, at the same time, let's begin to draft a document about how it's implemented, so we can work on both of those things simultaneously, as opposed to just pushing for the study, right? Because there's tons and tons of studies. I only showed you a handful of the books, but there's lots more, including the one here that you all worked on in New Jersey, and push the envelope and create a new pathway, if we understand that that pathway is attainable, if we understand that our work can create a new way of doing things, if we rely on our own collective understanding about how to push the envelope. If we know that our collective understanding about pushing the envelope is not just that I individually have the best answer, that if we understand that the answer is about us collectively developing it, then we begin to start thinking about these things differently, because it doesn't become about self. I want us to move away from the I created the best answer. I created, and I don't know why my camera's acting like it's moving around. I'm not moving it, but that I created the best answer. I have the best solution. No, it's not about any of that. It's about we. What is our collective we in the movement and the justification of the things that we're going to do to bring about reparations, and let it be holistic in its execution and in our understanding of it. When we think about it in a holistic way, that means we're going to talk about education, right? So I during my run for Congress, I talked about that if we really wanted to just start reparations, that we could say that education for African Americans is free up to a master's degree. We could do that tomorrow, right? And New Jersey actually provided the pathway for that in the CCOG, the College Opportunity Grant, the Community College Opportunity Grant for community colleges, so that it's a bridge gap and it's a bridge grant. And what it does is when there's the Pell Grant, that or if any of the things that they're getting funding for is not enough, the CCOG grant kicks in. The same thing could be true for reparations, that the reparations grants for education could be, once all the other things for African Americans have met that and they still have a shortage, then the reparation grant kicks in. And I would say also it includes books. And then that could have millions of African Americans who could go to school, and that could be something that addresses reparations immediately. We don't have to wait for that. So that these are things that are simple to do, that the cost would be understandable and executable in present day without a whole bunch of debate, discussion. And you all mentioned it before. The reason why that's imperative is that it was illegal for you to know your letters and numbers. It was illegal for you to read and write. And so then if we begin with that as a piece of reparations, that then we create the foundation of everybody who is descendant of those who were enslaved getting reparations. And we also have to address the we often kind of sweep this under the carpet, but there's the discussion about people who are recent migrants to the United States, whether they're from the Caribbean or Central or South America, or from the continent of Africa, and who might reparations go to. We allow ourselves to get engaged in that dialogue as a divide and conquer, and we see some of that has happened with our brothers and sisters with ADOS and Foundational Black Americans, that we've seen this kind of discord happening. And I think it's been destructive, and we need to figure out how we're going to move beyond the destructive nature of that dialogue to have, and I'm not saying we don't have dialogue, but it doesn't need to be destructive. We can figure out how to have that conversation in a constructive way that moves the agenda forward, so that reparations happens regardless. And if we are in the disagreement about its implementation, let us not be in disagreement about its implementation to the extent that it precludes it from happening at all. And that's where we oftentimes we end up, is that the divide and conquer becomes so ever present that it outweighs the issue at hand, and we don't have the time and space for that. Let our ancestors guide us. I'll end on this. Let our ancestors guide us that have always guided us. Let us call upon the nature and the presence of those ancestors to uplift us, to transform us, and connect us in places that we haven't figured out where we need it. Let all of our traditional African spiritual sources, whether it's Obatala or Olokun or any of the Loas, the Orishas, all of those spiritual forces that have brought us to this day, let them help us, guide us to figure out how we constructively work as Africans to get to the next place. Let that foundation create the place of connection as opposed to division. Ashe.
Shay. Thank you so very much. To all of our panelists, it's been an incredible discussion, really delving into these topics and all the different facets thereof that can at times seem overwhelming, but in reality, all really point to the simplicity of the challenges that we face, because it begins with identity, the removal thereof, and then the leaving of those who have lost who they've been known for, to then adopt the ideas that are impressed upon them, taking on characteristics that are not native to who they were meant to be. I appreciate all of your insights. I appreciate all that we shared on today. Moreover, I appreciate your work as you continue to fight on behalf of all those who continue to be plagued by oppression, by divisive rulings and laws and even practices locally that seek to not only divide, but conquer and destroy. To the listening audience, I need you to know that we have covered significant ground today. And it's important to understand that, as our panelists have noted, this is a status report, and a status report is only as good as the action that it inspires. The work of repair is not a passive event. It is an active, ongoing service to those with whom you are engaged, and even those you encounter daily. As the Frontiers International motto states, we stand for advancement through service. And we encourage you to stay engaged with the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice and the New Jersey Reparations Council. And on behalf of the Frontiers International Plainfield Area Club, I thank our distinguished guests, and I thank you, our audience, for your commitment to this critical dialogue. I am Safir Jenkins, and I wish you a good afternoon ahead. Peace.